The other main aspect or even axis of the RSD framework is degree of student autonomy, how much scope students have to engage in the research process. So at one end of the framework, where there's limited autonomy, we call that end prescribed research. We sometimes label it as level 1, it's coloured as red. And it's a very valuable part of the spectrum of the RSD, because that's where students learn how do you go about the processes here. What is appropriate in this discipline or this context? How do I ask questions? What sort of processes do I use? And even though it's often around cookbook laboratories in the sciences or given readings and with prescribed questions in, say, the arts, and it's all very prescribed and not typically viewed as on a research continuum, we think in the RSD that it is a very important part of that continuum so that students are immersed in the whole process and they have a certain type of comfort zone. And it's where sometimes even mimicking can be useful if it's going to lead somewhere else. If it stays as mimicking for an undergraduate degree, then that's a big problem. So the degrees of autonomy are all about how we may as educators scaffold students' learning. So the 6 facets of research that I talked about earlier are the what, and the levels of autonomy you could view as being the how we could operationalise those. The second level of autonomy we call bounded research. So think of the banks of a river, and the water has certain scope to flow. It doesn't flow outside of those banks, hopefully. And so students have a limited amount of choice. That shift from prescribed to bounded is a big shift for students because they have to make decisions. Do I look at this aspect or that aspect? Do I use this methodology or that methodology? There might be some grey in the actual answers, not so clear cut, but more argument. So the shift to from prescribed to bounded needs to be really managed, and some students can really get lost in that process. Other students may be ready to continue to fly, and the next level is scaffolded research, where if you think of the scaffolding of a building, that there's structure there, and scaffolds of buildings can often be used in very different ways. You could put up a home, you could put up an apartment complex, a tall skyscraper, all with the same scaffolding. So students have a large degree of independence, but prescribed, bounded and scaffolded are all educator initiated. They're driven by us as educators, and the students follow the lead to a lesser extent with the prescribed, to a greater extent with scaffolded. The next level up is a big shift, is the move to student initiated. They pose the questions, they completely determine the methodology. Level 4, so we'd call level 4 self-initiated. That's where students will determine much, as I already said, but they'll still have strong supervised guidance. So you'll say, oh, that question will lead you up a dead alley, or there's not much on that area, or you'll actually have a lot of trouble with the contamination of that methodology. So there's a lot of guidance necessary, but the students have initiated it. It's the big thing. Level 5 is where students, again, are initiated. We call it open research at level 5. It's the blue end of the spectrum. And the students are able to take full ownership. We're still there as educators. We're still there to supervise, to make sure that there's things that are not dangerous, things that are ethical. However, the students have a very full-bodied sense of ownership of the whole process, very much driving along with and negotiating timeframes, making sure that fit in. Now, level 5 or open research should not be seen as like potentially sloppy or just whatever goes, but students should be working with a level of rigour required of the year level, whether it's like a year 1 course or a year 3 course. They should also be working within the rigours of what the discipline requires, or the disciplinary or interdisciplinary context. So the 5 levels of autonomy give very much for us as educators a sense of how much structure and guidance do these students need at this point in time. And it's to give us a way to think about the issues that are so important to make the move from the implicit to the explicit.